Today we're going to do that with Alexander Ward, of course, national security reporter and anchor of the National Security Daily at Politico. And Alex, thanks for joining us again. And a great piece today with your colleague, Jonathan Lemire, talking about some of these little fissures that seem to be developing in the U.S.-Ukraine unity. Give us a little perspective. Obviously, the president has pledged that support as long as it takes, resisting the invasion. What are you starting to hear? What are you starting to sense? What are some of those little areas that are may become a little bit troubling along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear that still the headline is that the U.S. and Ukraine are remarkably united in terms of war aims, although there's always been differences in times of war. But I think the sort of narrative of, that Washington and Kyiv are in lockstep just doesn't seem to be as true as it used to be. One of the things is, the news of a pro-Ukraine group, allegedly sabotaging the Nord Stream 2 pipelines last year. There's no evidence that the Ukrainian government was behind it, but that makes it a little harder, especially for European countries and Germany most notably, to support Ukraine. You've also got the fact that the U.S. and Ukraine have differing objectives in Bakhmut, the city in Ukraine's east. Ukraine is going all out to try to hold it, but the U.S. openly and privately has said it's not strategic enough to expend so many resources. And then you also have a very clear difference, and one that's been in the open for a while, where Ukraine wants to start an offensive to take Crimea, which is the peninsula that Russia, quote-unquote, annexed in 2014. And the U.S. is pretty adamant that Ukraine doesn't have the military capability to take it. So that's just a few of them. But, you start putting them together, and then you notice that this sort of wall of stone, of unity, does have more cracks in it than it first meets the eye.
Yeah, and I think everyone is saying, hey, we want this to continue to work, to move forward. Obviously, getting Russia out of those spaces is important to everybody. And tell me how much of this, according to your sources, I know you talked to a number of administration officials, there's always going to be a portion of this kind of alliance where some armchair quarterbacking is bound to come in. How much of it is in that space versus how much of it is really rooted in reality of, hey, is it realistic to be able to do Bakhmut and Crimea, et cetera, as we get into spring?
Well, I think for the first, the U.S. has to be quite humble about what it can expect, what it expects Ukraine to be able to pull off militarily, because there was the belief that Russia could take Kyiv within days. Right. And obviously, here we are, more than a year later.
Yeah.
But I think outside of the normal, some mostly Republicans, but some Democrats who feel that the Biden administration has been too cautious in providing weapons to Ukraine, that it could be providing ATACMS, start training on F-16 fighter jets and other things like that. There are folks within the administration who are pushing for a more aggressive policy than is currently being enacted. A fairly open war between DOD and the State Department has broken out, and I say war. I'm emphasizing, but I mean, people at state would really want more weapons to be sent faster, more advanced weapons, and DOD, understandably, is worried about how much is in the U.S. arsenal. They worry about potential, future fights, like say with China over Taiwan. So it's a little more reticent to get rid of certain things. And as we've reported Politico before, the U.S. just doesn't have enough ATACMS, these long-range missiles that are a constant flashpoint, to provide to Ukraine, really. So there is a lot of armchair quarterbacking, but there are strong disagreements even within the administration about what to do.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. So one, just what we're able to do in terms of those weapons and those systems and training and so on. One of the other things you pointed out in your piece that got me thinking and I wanted to ask you about was related to this idea of the administration having a clear policy objective, a clear goal in terms of how they move forward. What's the sense there, again, internally? What are those discussions looking and sounding like?
Well, there really isn't much more definition outside of as long as it takes. No one in the administration has ever articulated anything other than, well, we will basically do what the Ukrainians want to do. Now, what the Ukrainians want to do, or at least their rhetoric is, they want to push Russia completely out of Ukraine. That includes Crimea and that includes the Donbass. But as we've discussed before, there are already differences on those objectives. Then there are those who would say, well, why wouldn't that be the U.S. objective? Would the U.S. be fine if Ukraine, say, and I'm hypothesizing, say that there was an effective trade of Crimea for the Donbass? Would the U.S. be okay with that? There are a lot of people in the U.S. who would say that we should have supported Ukraine further to be able to push Russia completely out of Ukraine. So there's also this disagreement inside the administration where they are, as long as it takes, we'll let Ukraine decide. There's no one is comfortable to come out and say what the U.S. wants, because at the end of the day, it's about what Ukraine wants. So internally, there's still disagreement about what the end game should look like. But in private, they'll give you their own thoughts. In public, they'll say it's up to Zelensky.
So interesting, and those behind doors conversations are always the ones that are so fascinating to me in terms of how that actually starts to create a trajectory in terms of the goals of the U.S. policy. As you look at it and moving towards spring, everyone has had their eye on that, not only in relation to Bakhmut, but to offensive both by Ukrainian forces and offensives surely coming from Vladimir Putin and Russian forces. How do you see that beginning to bubble up, and how will some of these little cracks potentially turn into bigger holes or to bigger challenges moving into the spring?
Well, I mean, the good news is, Russia's offensive has begun weeks ago, and it's a nothing burger so far. That's not to say that Russia can't come back and do more or conscript more forces or, use even more destructive weaponry. But I think if there's going to be, I think a lot of these cracks, right, I don't want to make too big a deal out of it, because I think still the headline is the U.S. and UK the U.S. and Ukraine are remarkably aligned.
Yes.
That said, I think Crimea is the big flashpoint. So if Ukraine makes a big play for Crimea, I think the Biden administration is in a very tough position, because they've openly said they don't think Ukraine can take it. And so it puts them in the position of arming Ukraine even further for a war or for a fight that they said Ukraine can't win, or leaving Ukraine alone and then risking the possibility that Ukraine does not win. And so I think, behind the scenes, you're going to, and of course in public, be hearing a lot of messaging about weaning Ukraine off the idea of taking Crimea. It could be a feint, by the way. Ukraine initially said they were planning an offensive somewhere. Instead, they went towards the south. So this could be Ukraine saying, hey, we're coming up to Crimea and focusing elsewhere. But let's see what happens here. But I fear that, or rather say, it's starting to seem like while things are good now, the longer this goes on, and we're not sure how long this goes on, these cracks will start to widen, and then you start seeing the U.S. and Ukraine with different objectives. And, of course, we could see a different administration here in the U.S. That has completely different viewpoint of the level of commitment and goals the U.S. should have towards Ukraine.
Fascinating. And then just real quick, as we wrap it up, we do want to be very clear that the alliance is solid and strong. These little cracks, we're not hoping any of those turn into big fissures, but cracks do tend to spread and grow, and they're also important just to have the conversations around them. And so before I let you go, are there any other of those little cracks that you're just kind of keeping your eye on that might be indicative of kind of the trajectory of the war moving forward?
Well, I think there's a good report in the New York Times about how the Pentagon is blocking the transfer of evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court. Now, the U.S., of course, has made a big thing about Russia has done this, they are committing these crimes, and we are going to help Ukraine make its case at such an international tribunal. But if the Pentagon is against it, for the main reason that they don't want international courts looking into the actions of U.S. troops abroad, well, then that really hurts that moral case. And if the U.S. isn't helping Ukraine with that anymore, or at least is even an impediment, does that cause a bigger split between Kyiv and Washington? I don't know, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Great insight, as always, Alexander Ward, national security reporter and anchor of the National Security Daily at Politico. Alexander, thank you so much, as always. Great perspective. All right, so many things to look at there, and I think Alexander got it right in terms of what will happen next. We'll continue to see a very united front and united messaging between Ukraine and the U.S., the sort of as long as it takes approach that President Biden has been touting. But under the surface, under the headlines, there are some of those smaller cracks that are going to become bigger challenges as things go on and the longer things are dragged out there in Ukraine by Vladimir Putin. And so many things to watch. We have to make sure we keep the alliance strong and focused. I think it's also important for the administration to be ready to communicate more with the American people and with the Congress in terms of what the strategy is, what the end goals are, and what is actually possible.
That'll provide Australia with nuclear-powered attack submarines. President Biden said the AUKUS pact would boost security and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. President Biden has said he intends to visit the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland to mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in April. Shares in banks around the world slumped on Monday, despite reassurances from President Joe Biden that the government would guarantee the customer deposits of two collapsed lenders, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. A storm that's ripped through Malawi has left about 100 people dead and has overwhelmed rescue teams. The government declared a state of emergency following Tropical Storm Freddie. South Korea says North Korea has fired two short-range ballistic missiles into the sea east of the Korean peninsula. It's the latest in a series of internationally banned weapons tests by the North. 2 people have been killed and 9 others injured in the Canadian province of Quebec when a vehicle veered off the road, striking pedestrians. The driver of the vehicle, a local man, has turned himself in. The Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has claimed his country is safer than the United States, despite the murder of 2 Americans who were kidnapped earlier this month. He criticized U.S. government warnings against travel to parts of Mexico. And President Biden has described changes to gender identity laws and treatment in Florida as close to sinful and said Republicans' efforts to limit transgender rights were cruel. Speaking on the late-night TV program The Daily Show, he said federal laws should be passed to ban states from curbing trans rights.
You with Business Matters here on the BBC World Service. We're going to talk submarines now. Not a topic we often pick up here on Business Matters, but there is quite a bit of money involved in this particular one because the leaders of the US, UK and Australia have unveiled new details of their plan to create a fleet of next-generation nuclear-powered submarines. Under the AUKUS agreement, as it's known, Australia will first receive at least 3 nuclear-powered submarines from the United States. The Allies will also look to work closely together with a new fleet of cutting-edge technology, including reactors made by Rolls-Royce in the UK. Well, President Biden has been speaking about the deal. Here he is speaking a little earlier.
The United States can ask for no better partners in the Indo-Pacific, where so much of our shared future will be written. Forging this new partnership, we're showing again how democracies can deliver our own security and prosperity, and not just for us, but for the entire world.
Well, that speech in the sunshine in San Diego, Southern California, was alongside the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and also the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak.
Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, China's growing assertiveness, the destabilizing behavior of Iran and North Korea all threaten to create a world defined by danger, disorder, and division. Faced with this new reality, it is more important than ever that we strengthen the resilience of our own countries.
So a few of the arguments being made there. For a bit more, we spoke to Sarah Jones, editor-in-chief and author at Politicus USA.
This is happening now, definitely because of the moves that are happening. China's growing aggressiveness and military strength, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, destabilization behavior from Iran and North Korea. And also earlier today, it was reported that the Chinese president will be traveling to Russia to meet with Putin as early as next week. So there's a lot of force working against democracy. And this was an attempt to link the allies in the Atlantic with the allies in the Pacific, which is one of President Biden's strategies.
Yeah, words and press conferences, often things that are done very well, right? And it looks very spectacular. Right. The sun's shining in San Diego. They all look very nice, shaking hands on the water there. Where the money comes in is, as I think as the Americans say, where the rubber meets the road. Extraordinary sums of money involved. Where are the commitments around that?
Yeah, Australia is paying for these submarines. I think what they were trying to push today was that this is going to create jobs in the UK and in Australia. And that's probably true because they're going to be training the Australians on this nuclear propulsion technology, which takes several years to get up to speed on. So where does this come into? Is it going to work? That's really the question. Do we have enough counter to all of this, the threats globally?
But even where you are politically, I mean, is there a political will for the type of spending? You know, nuclear submarines are not cheap things. Is there a type of will there for the money that President Biden said that they would purge today?
Well, you know, the funny thing about the United States is that there's always the will when it comes to defense spending and any money on any kind of aggression. You know, maybe the left will object, but overall, it always goes over pretty well.
And your sense then of the significance in terms of, I can see it on the screen in front of me here too, this awful word, this AUKUS pact. But in terms of these sort of recouplings, regroupings of nations, how significant that the US is reaching out in this way to begin that sort of process, I guess, of these new groupings of countries that perhaps will form that going forward?
I think it is very significant. It's the first time in 65 years. And they said today, the second time in history, I think the U.S. has shared their nuclear propulsion technology. So that just kind of shows the level of commitment and the need, I think, to stretch this alliance, to make it stronger, to reach across. Again, the allies in the Atlantic share it with the allies in the Pacific. And just the question remains, of course, that will this be enough? I think that's the question. We don't know. This is going to take several years to get up to speed. The alliance itself may be more important, frankly, than the submarines. And the pact also includes the plans to cooperate on artificial intelligence and cyber warfare, which is going to be a really big deal. Of course, it is right now. So it is a broader scope than just these submarines.
Sarah Jones speaking to us a little bit earlier on. Sinead Mangan in Perth. Sarah said the significance rather than the money, the most important bits there. What do you reckon?
Well, I mean, this is very fresh news here in Australia, and it's 5 hours old. I would say the money is very significant. I mean, it's $368 billion up to. So I don't think that's something you can sneeze on. It would be the biggest spend in defence for Australia ever. So I don't think we can put that to one side. It's certainly very significant. But looking at the relationship between the two countries, like I live in Perth, and just off of Perth, there's a place called Garden Island. There's a US sub, Asheville, parked outside there right now, just ahead of this announcement. So there's that feeling of the US enmeshment.
And
with
Sinead,
Australia.
is that all because of China? Is it as simple as that?
I did certainly that is a huge part of why this is happening, if the only reason that it's happening. And there are those that would be naysayers about this, and as to why would you go back to old alliances in a time where China is such an important trading partner to Australia, and this is the decision that's been made around the defence spend.
I think worth maybe putting people in the picture again, Sinead, on just the US. We've talked a lot about on this programme its turbulent relationship with China, but Australia and China have had a rocky old road right through the pandemic, haven't they?
They certainly have. China and Australia came to loggerheads at many stages. There was the stop in trade for some of the major goods that come out of Australia, but then underlying that, you've got iron ore continually goes up and down to China. So that relationship is never severed. There's just parts of the relationship are severed, and they're usually ones that they can manage, as the two countries can manage that relationship with those. For example, I'll give you a practical example. Lobsters were no longer going up to China, and that was the biggest market for Australian lobsters.
I remember
that
wine.
Was devastating.
I think we talked about on this program.
Yeah, and wine was another one. Yeah, so it tends to be like China would choose, no, we're not accepting that good anymore. That would affect a particular industry, usually a smaller industry, but it wouldn't be something as crucial as iron ore.
And in terms of
coal.
China as an export market for
it's
the number one,
the most important.
Yeah.
So hence why there's these kind of interesting reactions to this defence deal from various different sectors. I mean, literally the news has just been absorbed. The talk back this morning was hilarious, like it came from everywhere. And of course, you've got big bucks, big jobs, 20,000 jobs, numbers of people that will need to be skilled up, numbers of people that will need to go to the UK and to the US to be skilled up, because the engineering force alone to make this happen is extraordinary. And then young people that will need to be skilled up. And then it's that whole thing during COVID, as you said, different industries. We didn't have a massive manufacturing industry, and one of the big pushes were, well, why was that let go? This could be a way of resurrecting the manufacturing industry in Australia. So an awful lot of flags been waved for that. So it's been quite an extraordinary morning hearing what Talkback what Talkback had to say about it.
And just before I bring Steve back in, Sinead, I mean, what are some of the opposite arguments, I guess, arguments that are going on around this, pro and against. What are some of those bits of talkback that you've been getting?
Bits of talkback. Well, some of it is around the nuclear side of it. I think there would have been a misunderstanding once they were talking about nuclear. People thought that was nuclear capability rather than nuclear power. This isn't something that Australians are that comfortable with. So some of the ports where these subs will be parked, people are like, don't really want that in my backyard. Thank you very much. So that was part of it. Others would be, well, why would we do this? China is one of our biggest trading partners. Why would we put them off like that? There was that kind of thing. Then young people texting and saying, would you like to go to the US to be trained? And I sod that, not in probably those terms. I don't want to do that. So there's these kind of interesting kind of reactions, those immediate reactions to a huge piece of news, because there's no doubt it's a huge piece of news. And as I said, with mega bucks behind it.
Yeah, mega bucks, Steve. A lot of them coming from the president. So what's all this about?
Well, I like that Chinese wine ban on Australian wine, so send that extra Shiraz my way. That sounds really good. This is, again, don't forget, America, the numbers just no one cares, right? In America, we spend over $1.7 trillion a year in defense. So it's just, and we're talking, this is 2030 this is happening. That's a drop in the bucket for American business spending math. It's all about influence. It's all about, America. This is a deal between America, the UK, and Australia. Culturally, we are all very similar, liberal, Western, countries, or not, Western style countries, same language, a lot of shared culture. And I think, it's with Australia, I think they're going to, get the good deal. They're going to probably get extra stuff. I'm sure America will smile upon them even more. In terms
interesting
of
though, Steve, that re-embrace, wouldn't you say? Because certainly the Biden administration, with I'm speaking from here in the UK, certainly were pretty lukewarm towards a couple of the UK governments once in the early years of the Biden administration. It can't just be that he thinks Rishi Sunak's a nice man. There's something that's turned the corner a bit here too.
This is. I'm not saying nice man at all. I'm not saying it's not nice. What I'm saying is this is strategic, right? Since the war in Ukraine, it's changed a lot of stances in America. Look at Biden's opening oil fields now in Alaska. That was supposed to be no touch, right? He went to, suddenly Saudi Arabia went from a pariah to going over there for visiting, right? So this war, the energy, this has changed everything. And, Australia and the UK, I'm sure there's rifts here and there. But at the end of the day, these are historical allies. And for Australia, I'm sure not just the nuclear engineering, but everyone can share technology. They can, it's going to, hopefully be a trickle down effect.
And as a result, Steve, do you see this as the beginning?
Who knows?
Then do you see this as the beginning of more kind of investment in, I don't know, a whole range of different things? Do you think the US might start looking to more deals like this on a range of different things rather than Vietnam, wherever else it's been investing?
This is very complex, but I think obviously America and a lot of NATO wants to, push as much influence as they can in the Pacific as possible. And, Sinead smartly mentioned, China's a huge trading partner of Australia. It's also a huge trading partner of America. I'm talking to you on this iPhone I'm talking to you on right now. That wasn't made in Milwaukee, I'll tell you that.
But there are interesting decisions about where it is going to be made, right? Coming up.
100%.
And
100%.
I just wonder whether do you see this as sort of a gateway to doing, I don't know, to pushing more of these type of things, to say, well, gently suggesting, will we build US government contracts in Australia or in the UK or wherever it happens to be? Perhaps you, private company that we like to speak to in lobbying terms, should consider that too.
I think this deal is so significant in terms of not the 3 submarines, but we've never shared this technology to anyone but the UK, which is always, as been kind of a quote, special relationship. So I think that just shows that, America is willing to, share more sensitive technology with people and countries, I should say, sovereignties that we think are key partners in this.
And just a final thought around that, Steve. We've talked about it a couple of times on the program, but the polling around where the American public's appetite is in terms of, because this is all to do with geopolitics, isn't it? It's all to do with China and Russia again, and driven on exactly as you said by the war in Ukraine, where the appetite is for this kind of spending on this type of military capability. Do you think that there is still appetite for it in the US?